Party people, Tony Rowe here. How many of you guys who have played the Queen's Gambit Declined have run into the exchange variation and suffered immeasurably? At the very least, I will raise my hand because I have, and many times, in fact. Over the past maybe, I don't know, year or two, I've kind of casually on and off been playing the Queen's Gambit Declined, learning something about it. And especially at the club level, people will notice that the exchange variation, that variation being d4, not queen anything, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, and then c takes d5. And I've dabbled with knight takes d5, which is the semitarish, just to avoid this variation. But then eventually I just decided, okay, like let's dig into this. And typically continues bishop g5. White develops his bishop, starts to work up pressure against his d-pawn before playing e3. Just simple classical chess development in the center, putting your bishops outside the pawn chain, etc. And then black has a bunch of moves. But let's just outline why this variation is kind of annoying first. So white fixes the central pawn structure in this famous Carlsbad structure. That's what this is called. White has an extra center pawn. Black has an extra pawn on the queen side. Typically, black will play c6 at some point. White will play e3. For instance, just right now, in fact, c6, e3. Let's just put those moves on the board. And one unfortunate thing for black in this position, I think, is that just white's plans are easier to execute. And so I'm here to change that. A couple things usually happen. Black will typically play like bishop e7, knight b to d7, castles, rook e8, knight f8, some scheme to develop the pieces, protect the h-pawn, and white will go queen c2, bishop d3, and then execute one of two relatively straightforward plans. Either they'll go f3, knight g to e2, and push e4 at some point, trying to build up that ideal classical central pawn duo, or usually, again, with bishop d3, queen c2 already in, white will just go knight f3, castles, rook a to b1, b4, b5 with the so-called minority attack, and with the eventual goal of basically just playing b4, b5, b takes c6, b takes c6, and saddling black with this weak backwards c6 pawn, rook c1, queen c2, with the knight on e5. It can all come crumbling down, and unfortunately all of white's moves are straightforward. And even though a lot of people know like black should be playing for like a knight outpost on e4, playing for kingside attacks, it can be kind of complicated. So I set out to find some idea for myself to stop losing these games and suffering, and I'm just going to share that with you guys today. So backing up a little bit, let's talk a little bit more about the exchange variation. One thing to note is that white should not start with c takes d5 right away without the knight on f6. And that's because after c takes d5, knight c3, black is not obliged to go knight f6. And in fact, in my opinion, black should go c6. The point is, of course, is that if you wait a move, white has to commit to something other than bishop g5 immediately, which is the move that he really wants to play, like knight f3 or maybe a substandard square with bishop f5. And also, because this d5 pawn is now protected, black is sort of allowed to go bishop f5 right away, developing this dark light squared bishop to the optimal square before white can go bishop d3, queen c2. And we'll see in a lot of variations later, like just for instance, I'll play down our main line a little bit. One thing you see is that this piece is actually very hard to develop in the Queen's Gambit Declined exchange variation. It seems counterintuitive because when white goes c takes d5, e takes d5, you're freeing up the light squared bishop. But e6 is kind of a passive lame square. It sort of gets in the way of the e file. Bishop g4, it's kind of just floating out in the middle of nowhere. And d7, not only does it make no sense, but usually black wants to put the knight on d7. And so this becomes kind of a long-term problem piece. So going back all the way, if black is allowed to play bishop f5 in pretty much any place in the Queen's Gambit Declined, he's automatically usually very comfortable. And so even if white tries to get clever and go queen c2 here, we can insist with g6 and then something like, bishop f4, Bishop f5, queen d2, or queen b3, queen d2. Queen b3 probably met by queen b6, and queen d2 just very simple knight f6, and black is totally fine. So white is advised to start with this. And after knight f6, only then exchange. Again, there are other moves that other queen's gambits that avoid the exchange variation. They have their own problems. There's the Alatortsev, I believe it's called, with bishop to e7. There's also the Tarish with c5, or you could play the semi-Tarish as mentioned, but you have to be comfortable going into, positions that look like these, which might not be to everyone's taste. So worth considering, but we're going to focus on the exchange variation. Okay, so bishop g5. And again, c6 is not compulsory either. Bishop e7, totally possible. And knight b to d7, cute enough, is also a move, relying on the trap. Knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop d8, bishop b4 check when white has to throw the queen in the way anyway, and black is up some material. But c6, I think, is the most consistent for our repertoire. And after e3, again, queen c2 is possible. As is the case with all of my opening videos, I'm going high level-ish, and check the study that will be linked in the notes down below for all of the information. By the way, if you like my videos, please please comment, please subscribe. About half of the people that watch my video are not subscribed, which to me is hilarious. But yeah, just subscribe. You do me a solid. Thanks. Okay, so after e3, I usually, it's a weird habit of mine. I look at lines that annoy me after I update my chess-based database. So I go to Twik, I download all the games, I go to ICCF, I download all the new correspondence games, I merge my databases, I get everything set up, and then I go to see if anything new is being played, and all the lines I hate. And one thing I stumbled upon was this move h6 immediately. And h6 is flicked in tons of Queen's Gambit declined variations all over the place, especially the exchange, but not as much here. But here there's an interesting subtlety in that bishop f4 is not particularly exciting, again, because of bishop f5. And check the notes for why I think that's equal. Again, if black gets this move in comfortably, he's just comfortable. Let's put it that way. I mean, bishop d3 would just be met by bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and black has not only exchanged off a set of pieces, which eases his somewhat cluttered development, but also gotten rid of this light squared bishop, which usually is a problem piece. For white's light squared bishop, which is usually a very good piece on d3. So, yeah, and so white is forced to go bishop h4, and one of the things you get into with levels of sophistication in this Queen's Gambit decline is a lot of times white will retreat to the f4 g3 square to avoid trading off too many pieces and to keep this dark squared bishop, which is very powerfully placed compared to this bishop on e7. But when you force the bishop to h4 right away, white loses a lot of those options, as we'll see later, and just must sort of accept that bishop h4 is the only move because bishop f4, bishop f5 is not exciting. So we flick this in when white has to go bishop h4 instead of when down the line bishop f4 might be a better move. Keeping more pieces on. I'll show you an example later. And bishop e7, again, simple development, breaking the pin. Bishop d3, and again we see this idea of we're not going to allow bishop f5. That's bad news. So white stops it, puts his bishop on an active square. Castles, queen c2. And in a lot of Queen's Gambit decline variations, queen c2 would usually come with a threat on the h-pawn. For instance, bishop e7, bishop d3, same thing, queen c2, and then white is hitting the h-pawn because of the third bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, bishop takes h7 check. So compulsory here would be h6, or more commonly knight b to d7, so that bishop takes f6 can be met by knight takes f6. But we get to this position, then I'm going to recommend the move rook to e8, which is perhaps somewhat less natural than knight b to d7, but here it contains kind of a devilish point. And overall, white has pretty much has to decide which plan he's going for at this point. So if white has to complete development of his king side, he has to put this knight on a square generally. And if knight f3, white is giving up on this central pawn roller because really he needs to go f3, e4. And if knight g to e2, white is kind of showing his cards that he's going to go f3, e4. If knight f3, you know he's not going to go e4, and he's going to go rook a to b1, b4 in most cases, and go for this minority attack. The knight is, I would say, better placed on f3 for the minority attack, not only because it can go to the e5 square, but also because I think it does a little bit better job of guarding white's king side. It's not really sort of redundant with this knight on c3, etc. So there's kind of two main moves here. It should be noted that f3 is possible and has been played more times than it should have been. But c5 immediately is quite good for black in this case. If white takes, then e3 would be under a tremendous pressure from the bishop on c5, the rook on e8. I think white would probably be close to losing there. And if knight g to e2 instead, then c4 is annoying because of knight c6, threatening knight b4, then takes, then knight d3 check, which would be a massacre. And if a3, then b5. I'll leave it at that. Check the notes for more. But so f3 is inaccurate. White generally chooses between knight f3 and knight g to e2. So let's go for knight f3 first. This is kind of more illustrative of what we're after. And also for me, historically, I've been happy when white goes knight g to e2 and f3, because at least it leads to kind of like a full-blooded double-edged struggle. When white goes f3, e4, like the game gets a little bit more complicated. But knight f3 can tend to be a little bit more one-sided if white starts going rook a to b1, b4, b5, and black doesn't whip up counterplay. You just get weaknesses on the queen side, and white just gets to build up and make you suffer. And so the one thing I like about this line is that knight f3 is almost completely nullified by this move knight e4. And it's actually tremendously significant that this bishop is on h4. In this specific position, because of the threat of bishop takes h4, bishop e7 is pretty much forced, and after queen to e7, we see the idea of like this rook e8. We have this discovered defense of the knight on e4. Because bishop e7 is forced, queen takes e7 is the response. We have three defenders of this knight on e4, three attackers, everything's square. And basically, when you bust open the center like this and initiate this active play, white doesn't really have much time for rook b1, b4, b5. It's too slow of a plan in this case. And after castle's main move, bishop f5, black is totally fine. Again, there's basically rook a to b1 or knight e5 as possible moves. Knight e5 should be met by knight d to e7 and a bunch of knight d7, bunch of exchanges take place. And rook a to b1, knight d7, b4 is actually very convenient that this rook is on b1, because after knight takes c3, white doesn't really have time for this move because of this move. And so he has to sort of acquiesce to these exchanges. And after a6, black is very solid. And a4, kind of insisting on this minority attack, allows knight b to knight b6. When a5 would be kind of probably positional suicide, black could go knight c8 to d6, or even just hop into c4. So white kind of has to just protect it. And then knight c4 anyway. And if b5, black has sort of a non-standard idea, but an idea worth remembering. And c takes b5, a takes b5, a4, solidifying this passed pawn on the a file, nullifying white's queenside pressure. White doesn't get to really enforce any weaknesses on the queen side. And that's the idea. And this idea does not work, most importantly, if h6 and bishop h4 are not in. So like if we roll it all the way back and we kind of play the same thing with bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, queen to c2. Of course, h6 is still possible, but now bishop f4 is kind of annoying. The reason being is that on some level in the Queen's Gambit decline, black needs to exchange like a set of minor pieces. maybe 2, honestly. Space is equal in the center, but black finds his development somewhat cramped. It's hard to find a square for this piece. This piece really can only go to d7, and because of this strong bishop, like queen b6 doesn't really make any sense, queen a5 doesn't really make any sense. Those moves might run into like rook a b1 or a3 b4 or knight a4 hitting the queen followed by knight c5. Like black's queen doesn't really want to hang out on the queen side, and it can't sit safely on c7 either, and so it's hard to get all of black's pieces off the back rank when you can't exchange off the dark squared bishops. If you exchange off the dark squared bishops, then the queen comes to e7 very easily, rook comes to e8, and you just have to kind of deal with this light squared bishop, which is a little bit easier when you've exchanged off a set of pieces. Like if you go here, well, let's start with knight h5. If you just continue to try and exchange pieces, white can kind of reject the idea, and then after knight b to d7, go h3. And if knight takes e5, d takes e5, and there's a massive threat of g4, trapping your knight. And if you go g6, then I think white is just more comfortable in this position still. Again, check out the notes. And if you try and kind of preempt knight h5 with knight b to d7, then white can save the bishop with h3, and knight h5 would just be met very comfortably with bishop h2. And again, you would suffer from like this lagging development on the queen side when it's just very hard to organize your pieces. And white just has very active, well-centralized, easily developed pieces. And so h6 in this position, again, note that there's this threat like I talked about before. h6 in this position, bishop f4. It is possible to go rook e8. The point being that if bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, bishop takes h7, king h8, black has the threat of g6, trapping the bishop. And if bishop d3, then bishop d4 wins the pawn back. The problem is that on rook e8, again, continuing down the same line that we would just with h6, bishop h4, not inserted. If knight e4 now, then again, bishop h4. So you're hitting the bishop, but bishop h4 is annoying. Whereas if we go back, same position, we play knight f3, knight e4, bishop g3, refusing to exchange the bishops doesn't make any sense because of just knight takes g3 when black is very comfortable. So the fact that f4 is not available because your bishop on h4 is actually very significant. So that's the key detail. We flick in h6 when white can't go bishop f4, and then later he's stuck kind of exchanging on e7, which very much eases our development. So that's rook e8, knight to f3, knight e4. That's the key move. And again, we covered f3, c5. The other main move is knight g to e2. And this plan, I think, was made most famous by Botvinnik during his reign. This plan of going basically castles short, f3, and down the line going e4. And another very famous game, I think, is Kasparov versus Ulf Anderson. I don't know the year of that game, but I will, if I remember, I'll link to it down below, just so you can see how bad the exchange with f3 can get for black as well. Excuse me. And a vast majority of the games have continued knight b to d7 here, which is not in any way a bad move, by the way. Like totally playable, totally fine. But again, updating my database, I stumbled upon this move a5, which at first glance, I would not forgive you for asking, like, what the hell does this do? The idea is relatively simple. First of all, black gains space on the queen side. How relevant that is in this specific position, I'm not sure. Again, white tends to not go rook b1, b4 when the knight is on e2, but it's possible. The main point is that black is going to go knight a6 and does not want to allow, like, knight a6 in this position, bishop takes a6, b takes a6 would be a positional disaster. And so black goes a5, intending to go knight a6, which would threaten knight b4 winning the light squared bishop, which would be a huge victory. Not only because black exchanged pieces, but because he won the two bishops. So white typically after castles knight a6 goes a3, and then black goes knight c to e7. And this is an interesting square for black's knight. There are multiple different ideas here for black. The first one is just that in a lot of positions, because white is going f3, e4, d4 ends up being kind of a weak square and a weak pawn. And so the knight swinging over to e6 tends to be kind of annoying. And the second idea is that using a5, a4, in a lot of positions, black can go b5, b4, using this a pawn and also disrupting the e4 square, disrupting this knight, which is kind of short on great squares especially because it can't go back to e2 because of this knight. And also, as we'll see in some lines, after b5, b4, black can exchange off this problematic dark squared bishop or light squared bishop with bishop a6. When it's hard for white to avoid that exchange. So there's a lot of like little micro ideas here. There's, knight going to e6. In a few variations, it even goes to b5. And then b5, b4. It's also possible in some cases to go b5 and bishop b7, looking to organize c5 at some point. More rare. In most of the games, white goes f3. This is a very rare unplayed idea right now, but I think it's promising. And there are similar ideas in other variations, but in this exact position, there's maybe like 30 games in my database, 16 games in the Lee Chess database. But okay, so again, white typically continues with f3. There are a couple moves, I covered them in the notes. And first thing to note actually is that c5 here right away is quite good, similar to how we played f3, c5 immediately instead of one of the knight moves for white. It's still good here. After d takes c5, bishop takes c5, black again is threatening this e4 pawn, and white has sort of like this miracle resource, knight d1, hitting the bishop and also protecting here. This is not to be recommended. I'll just leave it at that. And so black has typically gone bishop b6, and only 1 or 2 games have reached this position, both correspondence games. They both played queen b3. And after knight a6, the highest ranking game was Sherwood versus, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. You can check in the notes, friggin' German. Black went knight a6, threatening knight to c5, and white felt strongly enough about it to play bishop a6, rook a6, queen d3, and queen d6, breaking this pin. And I think black was pretty comfortable in this game. Again, e3 is weak. Black has the 2 bishops. There's maybe like long-term ideas of knight d7 to c5, for instance, or bishop d7, a4, clamping down on the queen side. Check that out. I'm leery to take on isolated pawns myself statistically, or just historically, I haven't liked them. So I'll give you a second option in b5. And again, it looks kind of odd because you're giving yourself this backward c pawn, but it's actually hard for white to really do anything with it, because he would have to really contort himself with this knight to actually try and pressurize it, and then maybe just bishop a6 or bishop b7 followed by knight e6 is just solid enough for black, and black can continue like with the b4 plan or rook c8, b4, c5, that kind of stuff. So not super dangerous to give yourself this. And again, with white looking to go e4 at some point in the future, being able to dislodge this knight is relevant. And we have this idea of going bishop a6 and b4 at some point. It looks sort of enticing to go a4 in a lot of these positions, clamping down on the queen side, but I think that on some like sort of deeper level, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that, because black's theater of action is on the queen side. We need to whip up counterplay there to counteract this slow buildup in the center. And if we close up the queen side, we're giving white too much of a free hand on the center and the king side. So just keep that in mind. And it's worth considering e4 right away. It does not work. And this is typical of the exchange variation as a whole, is that white needs to build up to it a lot more. If d takes e4, f takes e4, then knight g4 is very strong. Again, looking to exchange off these bishops. And here it's even worse, because because of f3, white has really weakened a lot of dark squares in his position. Like knight e3 is already a threat, and you could imagine like h2 is a little bit loose here. F4 can be loose, and or d4 can be loose, and when it does fall, it falls with check, for instance, a lot of times, so it's risky. Bishop g3, knight e3, of course, and if here, probably just takes, and we win the two bishops, and white has horrifically weak dark squares, so typically white just takes here to not lose time. And after rook e7, we have this threat, queen d2, knight e6. We have this threat, bishop c2, rook d7, again, threatening this. Rook a to d1, and I think b4 gives black pretty solid counterplay after bishop a6 coming up next move. So there's more variations than notes, but you can check that out. Okay, it's also possible, like after this, white should take here, but again, like if this is the best white has, is exchanging off more pieces, not particularly exciting. I think this move is fairly cute, allowing this because of this, when bishop e2 and takes here is a threat. And in fact, both captures on b5 here liquidate down to the same exact completely equal ending. For instance, here, 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 and here. Equal. Okay, speed chess. All right. So e4 right away doesn't work, and you can see some of the problems that white incurs from allowing this exchange of dark square bishops. So in many exchange type of positions, white plays bishop f2. This is the only move to have been played in this position. I can only find one game to reach this position. White played bishop e2, and here I'd recommend knight e6. And again, similar problems. If here, then takes, knight g4 is very annoying, because again, bishop g3, knight e3. Of course, h4 is impossible, and if white plays pretty much anything, I'm going to snap this thing off, grab the two bishops, permanently destroy you on the dark squares, etc. So white, again, another typical exchange variation move, plays king h1. Not only is it useful to get your king off his diagonal when you move the f-pawn, but now in response to knight g4, white has bishop g1, which is key. Here I'd recommend just simple, bishop a6, again, kind of going along with our plan, and after e4, finally going b4. And the idea is on this move to take here instead, winning some time, because now white has to go back, takes, and now we have this very cute move, knight c5, which guarantees good counterplay for black, exploiting this pin to win this bishop, because if bishop c2, e4 is hanging. So something like this is forced, and the line that I have is bishop f8, hitting here, knight c3, c5, again exploiting this pin along the d file, d5, and then bishop d6. And this is another common exchange variation theme, is that when white finally gets it in, you take c5, and force white to fracture that pawn duo in a way where you can kind of like fill in the holes, essentially. So here we force white to go d5, and then we play bishop d6 to go bishop e5. And that's going to be the plan going forward, is bishop e5, bishop takes c3, knight e4. And even if you lose the c5 pawn, you're liquidating down to, I think, what is a very comfortable ending. So yeah, that's the exchange variation in a nutshell. I think I found a pretty clear-cut and relatively easy idea. Again, h6, c6, protecting your d-pawn, standard stuff, e3, h6, bishop h4, bishop f4, bishop f5, and then we go with this plan of rook e8, knight f3, knight e4, liquidating down to equality without allowing the minority attack, or rook e8, knight g to e2, and then a5. There are similar lines if you guys hate some of this, like for instance, a line which Rajabov has used quite successfully recently is this line with g6. So like in this position, he hasn't played h6, which gives him the option of going g6 instead. This line is very interesting as well. The idea is long term, one of the ideas is to go knight e6, hitting the bishop, and when white moves the bishop, you go bishop g7 and bishop f5, or knight g7 and bishop f5, for instance, trying to trade off the light squared bishops. Or like, again, building up with rook a to d1, knight e6, bishop h4, you again go with this same b4 move. And in this case, a5 isn't in, you don't really need it. Black is typically going to look to play something like bishop b7, b4, and c5, ripping the position open and trying to get at those loose dark squares. Yeah, so that's another idea. This is Rajabov, Mamedyarov. I think they played 2 games in maybe a candidates tournament. Rajabov might have even won one, but Rajabov also played this against Nepomniachtchi about a year ago and has played it a bunch of times since. Black scores great here. So if you hate my line, you can play this line, for instance. It's also very good. Unfortunately, this is not a solution against knight to f3. So in this case, you haven't played h6, bishop h4, rook e8, so you're not ready to do this knight e4 shenanigans. You'd have to find some other line against knight f3 here, for instance. But another line to consider. There are many more resources. This position's so rich. There are a ton of ideas. There's playing d4, d5 by Nikos Naturlis of Quality Chess. He's got a different idea. And yeah, see what you guys think. Try it out. Oh my God, how long has it been? How long did you see that? How long was it like this? Oh no. Oh no. How long did I record like that? Well, I'll figure it out afterwards. If I cut off the top, I'm sorry. Maybe I'll re-record it. Maybe I won't. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is Tony Rowe, out. Peace.